My beloved child. There are some truths that remain hidden not because they are unimportant, but because the person carrying them has spent so much time being afraid of what would happen if they were finally spoken aloud. You may have felt that kind of silence before. A silence that did not feel empty. A silence that felt crowded with everything someone refused to say. Perhaps there was a person whose behavior never quite matched their words. They could be warm one moment and distant the next. They could remember the smallest things about you and then behave as though none of it mattered. They could look at you with an expression that seemed to hold a question, only to turn away before you had the courage to ask what was behind it. And because they never said what you needed to hear, you eventually began questioning what you had seen. Maybe you imagined the lingering glances. Maybe you misunderstood the sudden changes in their voice. Maybe that message they almost sent meant nothing. Maybe the way they became unusually quiet whenever someone mentioned your name was simply coincidence. You told yourself these things because uncertainty is exhausting, and sometimes the mind would rather accept a painful explanation than remain trapped inside a question with no answer. But there was something you did not know. They had been carrying a secret. Not the kind of secret that belongs to a dramatic story. Something much more ordinary. Much more human. They cared about you more deeply than they were willing to admit. And for a long time, they believed they could keep it hidden. They thought they could control what their face revealed, control the distance between you, control the conversations they avoided, and control the memories that kept returning when they were alone. They were wrong. Because feelings that are continually denied do not always disappear. Sometimes they find other ways of speaking. They appear in hesitation. In jealousy that is quickly disguised as indifference. In a person's sudden interest when your name is mentioned. In the way they remember something you said years ago even though they pretended not to listen when you said it. In the questions they ask about you while pretending they are asking for someone else. And sometimes, when a secret has been protected for too long, it escapes through the smallest opening. That is what happened here. It began with something so ordinary that nobody understood its importance at first. Someone asked about you. Not directly. Not in a way that would have made the room go quiet. Your name simply entered a conversation, almost casually, and the person who had spent so long hiding what they felt suddenly became different. Their expression changed before they could stop it. It lasted only a moment. But someone noticed. A friend sitting nearby noticed the silence that followed. They noticed how quickly the conversation moved away from you. They noticed the person who usually had an answer for everything suddenly had nothing to say. And that small moment planted a question. Why? Why did your name matter so much? The person carrying the secret tried to laugh it away. They said it was nothing. They said they had simply been surprised. They changed the subject. And everyone let the conversation continue. Everyone except the person who had noticed. Because sometimes people who know us well can recognize the truth before we are ready to recognize it ourselves. Later, when they were alone, the person thought about that moment. They remembered the look on their friend's face. They knew they had almost been discovered. For a few minutes, they felt something close to panic. Not because they were ashamed of caring about you. That was never really the problem. The problem was that admitting it would mean admitting something else. They had lied. Not necessarily to you. Mostly to themselves. They had spent so long convincing themselves that what they felt was temporary that they had never allowed themselves to consider what it would mean if it wasn't. They had called it attachment. They had called it nostalgia. They had called it loneliness. They had called it familiarity. Anything but love. Because love, to them, meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant losing control. You had never understood why they sometimes seemed to come close and then retreat. There were moments when you thought perhaps something was finally changing. Then they would become distant again. You would replay the conversation later, searching for the moment when you had said something wrong. But there was no single mistake. The distance had not always been caused by something you did. Some of it came from a battle happening inside them. They wanted to be near you. And they were frightened by how much they wanted it. There was a memory they rarely allowed themselves to revisit. It was not a grand romantic moment. That was part of what made it so difficult. It was a simple day. You had been talking about something ordinary, something neither of you could remember clearly anymore. You were distracted. You did not notice that they had stopped speaking. You did not notice them watching you for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then you had looked at them and asked, almost casually, "What?" They had smiled and said, "Nothing." You accepted the answer. But they remembered the moment. They remembered the feeling that moved through them when you looked directly at them. They remembered thinking, with a kind of quiet fear, that they were becoming attached to something they did not know how to protect. That was the beginning. Not the beginning of love, perhaps. Maybe the feeling had existed before. But it was the beginning of their awareness of it. And instead of allowing themselves to understand it, they began trying to manage it. They became careful. Too careful. They measured their words. They avoided certain questions. They noticed when you were around and pretended not to. They wanted to know whether you were happy, but asking felt too revealing. So they found indirect ways. They listened when someone else mentioned you. They remembered things you had forgotten telling them. They noticed when your voice sounded different. They could tell when something was wrong before you said anything. And yet, when you needed reassurance, they sometimes became strangely unavailable. That contradiction hurt you. You could feel that something existed between you, but you could never hold it in your hands. There was no confession. No clear promise. Only moments. And moments are difficult things to build certainty from. Eventually, you stopped trying. That was the part they never expected. They had assumed your patience would continue. They assumed you would always be there. Not because they consciously believed they deserved you, but because they had become accustomed to the quiet place you occupied in their life. Then you stepped back. You did not make a dramatic announcement. You did not demand an explanation. You simply stopped reaching toward a door that never seemed to open. And that silence affected them more than they admitted. At first, they told themselves it was temporary. You were busy. You needed space. You had your own life. There was nothing wrong. But then the days continued. And the absence became noticeable. They reached for their phone more often than they wanted to admit. They opened old conversations. They scrolled past your name. Sometimes they typed something. Then deleted it. The first message was easy. "Hey, how have you been?" Too casual. Deleted. Then. "I was thinking about you." Too honest. Deleted. Then. "I hope you're okay." That sounded safer. They stared at it. Deleted that too. Because the problem was never finding words. The problem was knowing what the words would lead to. If they asked how you were, they might have to explain why they cared. If they admitted they missed you, you might ask why they had spent so long acting as though they didn't. If they confessed what they felt, there would be no place left to hide. So they said nothing. And you interpreted the silence differently. You thought perhaps they had moved on. Maybe they had. Maybe the connection had only mattered to you. Maybe all those small moments had been nothing more than things your heart had wanted to believe. That thought hurt. But eventually, you began accepting it. And something changed in you when you did. You stopped waiting for an explanation. You started living without one. That was when they truly began to understand what your absence meant. Not because losing access to you suddenly made you valuable. You had always been valuable. They simply had not understood that love cannot remain permanently hidden behind hesitation without eventually creating distance. They had protected themselves so carefully that they had also protected themselves from receiving you. And now they had to live with that choice. Still, they did not confess. Not yet. Instead, the secret became something their closest friend could feel. The friend had known them for long enough to notice the difference. One evening, the conversation returned to you. Again, almost accidentally. This time the friend did not let it pass. They looked at the person and asked, "Why does everything change when someone mentions them?" There was a pause. A real one. The kind that becomes louder than an answer. The person smiled awkwardly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Their friend did not argue. They simply watched them. Then came the question that had been waiting underneath every other question. "Do you still love them?" The person looked away. For a moment, there was no defense. No clever response. No joke. Nothing to hide behind. And finally they said something so quiet that it almost disappeared. "I don't know how not to." That was the first time the secret became a sentence. Not a confession to you. Not yet. But a confession nonetheless. Their friend understood. And instead of celebrating, they became serious. "Then why did you let them go?" The person had no immediate answer. Because the honest answer was uncomfortable. They had been afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of being exposed. Afraid that you would discover how much influence you had over them. Afraid that if they gave you the truth and you did not want it, they would have nowhere left to hide. So they had chosen the safer pain. Silence. But safe pain is still pain. And sometimes it lasts much longer than the risk you were trying to avoid. Their friend asked one more question. "Do they know?" The person shook their head. "I don't think so." And that was when their friend said something they could not forget. "Maybe they should." The sentence stayed with them. Not because it was romantic. Because it was frighteningly simple. Maybe you should know. Maybe you had spent enough time doubting yourself because they had refused to tell you the truth. Maybe keeping the secret was no longer kindness. Maybe it had become selfishness. They went home that night carrying a decision they were not ready to make. They opened the old conversation again. Your name was still there. Your messages were still there. Little pieces of a life they had convinced themselves they could leave untouched. They read one of your older messages. It was not profound. You had simply asked if they were okay. They remembered how they had answered. I'm fine. They had not been fine. They had just not known how to tell you that being close to you frightened them. Their eyes remained on the screen. Then they noticed something else. A message they had sent you months earlier. They had written something unusually warm. You had replied with equal warmth. And then, frightened by what they had revealed, they had become distant afterward. You probably remembered the change. You probably wondered what you had done. They remembered too. And suddenly the guilt was heavier than the fear. Because you had been left to interpret behavior they themselves had created. You had blamed yourself for a confusion they had caused. That realization changed something. Not everything. But something. The next morning, their friend spoke to them again. This time, there was no teasing. No curiosity. Only honesty. You can't keep expecting them to understand a truth you refuse to speak. The person remained silent. Then they said, "What if I tell them and everything changes?" Their friend answered, "It already changed." Those words stayed with them. Because they were true. The relationship had already changed. The silence had changed it. The distance had changed it. The unanswered questions had changed it. You moving forward had changed it. There was no longer anything left to preserve by pretending. And yet, they still hesitated. That is what makes people human. Knowing the right thing does not always make doing it easy. They needed time. And during that time, something unexpected happened. Someone else mentioned you in a conversation. This time, they did not hide their reaction quickly enough. They smiled. Just for a second. It was an unconscious smile. A smile connected to a memory. Someone noticed. Another person asked, "You know them?" The person said yes. Then came another question. "Were you two ever together?" They shook their head. No. The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, someone laughed softly and said, "You should have seen your face when their name came up." There was a silence. The person looked around. Suddenly, they realized something. The secret was no longer entirely theirs. It had begun appearing in the spaces between their words. Other people were beginning to notice. Not because they had announced anything. Because hiding something for too long can make the hiding itself visible. The more they tried to behave normally, the more unnatural their behavior became. If someone mentioned you, they became quiet. If someone asked whether they had spoken to you, they became defensive. If someone said you seemed happy, they wanted to know more. If someone suggested you might be interested in someone else, they felt something sharp inside them that they immediately tried to dismiss. And eventually, someone asked the question out loud. "Are you jealous?" They laughed. But the laugh did not sound convincing. No. The person who asked simply smiled. They knew. Perhaps everyone knew before the person carrying the secret finally admitted it. And that is how the truth began moving beyond them. Not through a dramatic declaration. Through little cracks. A reaction here. A sentence there. A memory that was too specific. A concern that was too personal. A name that made their expression change. Soon, the people around them began understanding something that you still did not know. You were not imagining it. There had been something real beneath the silence. The strange part was that the person still had not told you. They were waiting for the perfect moment. But perfect moments are often excuses created by frightened hearts. There was always another reason to wait. They were not ready. You might be busy. It might be the wrong time. Perhaps you had moved on. Perhaps they should leave you alone. Every reason sounded sensible. And every reason kept the truth buried. Until one day, the secret came out without permission. Someone asked about you in front of a small group of people. The person carrying the secret was tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Tired of pretending. Tired of correcting people when they noticed. Tired of hearing your name and acting as though it meant nothing. The question was simple. Do you still care about them? For years, perhaps, they would have laughed. This time, they did not. They looked down. And after a long silence, they answered. Yes. Nobody spoke. Then someone asked, "How much?" The person swallowed. And for the first time, there was no attempt to make the answer smaller. More than I ever admitted. That was it. The secret was no longer secret. Not because they had planned a confession. Not because they had prepared the perfect speech. Because eventually the truth became heavier than the fear of being known. The people around them were quiet. Someone looked surprised. Someone else seemed to have suspected it for a long time. But the person carrying the secret felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness. Not certainty. Relief. Because hiding had required constant effort. And suddenly, they no longer had to pretend that you were insignificant. They could say your name without immediately changing the subject. They could admit that they missed you. They could acknowledge that they had been afraid. They could finally stop pretending that losing you had not affected them. But then came the question that mattered. Does the other person know? Their expression changed. No. And the relief disappeared. Because admitting the truth to everyone else was not the same as telling you. You were the one person who needed to hear it. And you were still somewhere outside the room, living your life, unaware that the story had changed behind your back. That night, they understood something painful. A public confession was not the same as courage. Courage would be telling the person they had hurt. Courage would mean allowing you to respond however you wanted. Courage would mean accepting that the truth does not guarantee the ending you hope for. They had spent so long wanting to control the outcome. But love cannot be controlled that way. You cannot confess only if you are guaranteed forgiveness. You cannot apologize only if you know the other person will come back. You cannot tell the truth only when the answer is certain to comfort you. Sometimes honesty means opening your hands and accepting that the person on the other side may choose differently. That frightened them more than anything. Still, they wrote to you. This time they did not delete it. They did not make it dramatic. They did not write paragraphs about destiny. They simply told you they needed to speak. You saw the message later. And for a while, you did nothing. Because you had learned not to run toward every small sign of hope. You had learned that a message could mean many things. You had learned to protect yourself from assumptions. So you waited. Eventually, you agreed. When you finally met, neither of you knew exactly how to begin. There was a strange tenderness in that awkwardness. Two people who had once known how to talk for hours suddenly searching for safe words. They looked at you. You looked back. And for a moment, everything they had rehearsed disappeared. They had imagined telling you so many times. In every imagined version, they were confident, calm, certain. But real life does not obey rehearsals. They looked down and said, "I owe you an explanation." You did not answer. So they continued. "I know I made you feel like you imagined things. That sentence made you still." They looked at you again. "I know there were moments when I came close and then disappeared. I know I gave you reasons to question yourself. You wanted to say something. But they were not finished. I was afraid." Simple words. No excuses. Just the truth. You asked, afraid of what? They took a breath. Of how much I cared. You looked away. There are certain sentences that arrive after you have spent so long convincing yourself you will never hear them that, when they finally come, you do not immediately know what to feel. Relief can look like sadness. Validation can feel like grief. And sometimes the truth hurts precisely because it confirms what you once hoped was true. They continued. "I thought if I kept it hidden, I could control it." A faint, almost bitter smile crossed their face. "I couldn't." You remained quiet. They told you about the moments they had hidden. The conversations they had pretended did not matter. The times they had wanted to reach out. The messages they had written and erased. The questions they had asked other people because asking you directly felt too frightening. And then they told you something you had never known. Other people had begun noticing. The secret had become visible. Not because they wanted attention. Because they had failed to hide it. You listened. Part of you wanted to believe every word. Another part of you remembered the loneliness you had felt while waiting for those words. You finally asked the question that mattered more than the confession. Why didn't you tell me when I was still there? They had no beautiful answer. They could have said they were confused. They could have blamed circumstances. They could have talked about timing. Instead, they said, because I was selfish. The honesty hurt. But it was different from the excuses you had expected. They continued. I wanted to keep you close without risking rejection. I wanted you to understand me without me having to expose myself. I wanted the comfort of knowing you were there while protecting myself from the possibility that you might not feel the same. Their voice became quieter. And I didn't realize what that was doing to you. You looked at them. That was the part that hurt most. They nodded. I know. No, you said softly. I don't think you do. They waited. You told them what the silence had done. How many times you had gone home wondering whether you had misunderstood everything. How often you had replayed ordinary conversations. How you had questioned your own instincts. How you eventually stopped asking because asking had begun to feel humiliating. They listened. For once, they did not defend themselves. They did not interrupt. They did not try to make your pain smaller so theirs would feel easier to carry. They simply listened. And perhaps that was the first truly honest thing between you. Not the confession. Not the secret becoming public. The listening. When you finished, there was a long silence. Then they said, I'm sorry. You believe they meant it. But belief is not the same as forgiveness. And forgiveness is not the same as returning. That distinction mattered. You had spent too much time learning that love alone cannot repair everything. Someone can love you and still hurt you. Someone can regret losing you and still not know how to love you properly. Someone can finally tell the truth and still arrive too late. The confession did not erase the past. It simply allowed you to see it differently. And perhaps that was what you needed most. Not necessarily to get them back, but to stop blaming yourself for a story you had never been given enough information to understand. The truth had finally reached you. Not in the form you once imagined. Not with perfect timing. Not with certainty about what would happen next. But it had arrived. And now the choice belonged to you too. That mattered. Because for so long, their fear had controlled the relationship. Their silence determined the distance. Their hesitation determined what you were allowed to know. Now that the truth was spoken, you did not have to rush toward an answer simply because they had finally found courage. You could take your time. You could forgive without returning. You could care without reopening the same wound. You could even love someone and still decide that the version of the relationship they were capable of giving you was not enough. And strangely, that understanding brought peace. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives when you realize you no longer need another person's confession to prove that your feelings were real. You had known something was there. You were not foolish. You were not imagining every moment. But you also learned something else. Sometimes our hearts are right about another person's feelings and still wrong about what those feelings will lead to. Love does not automatically produce courage. Regret does not automatically produce change. Missing someone does not automatically make a relationship healthy. And a public secret is still only a secret made visible. The real question is what someone does after the truth is known. That was where their journey had to begin. Not with another promise. With different behavior. They understood that now. They did not ask you to forget what happened. They did not ask you to trust them immediately. They simply said, if you ever give me another chance to be in your life, I want to earn it differently. You did not promise anything. And for once, they accepted that. Maybe that was the beginning of real change. Because love becomes more honest when it stops demanding immediate reassurance. The days that followed were quieter. People around them knew the truth now. There was no secret left to protect. But strangely, the public knowledge did not make the relationship easier. It made it more real. They could no longer hide behind ambiguity. If they cared, their actions had to show it. If they were afraid, they had to admit it. If they made a mistake, they had to take responsibility. And you watched. Not suspiciously. Carefully. There is a difference. You were no longer waiting for a confession. You were watching for consistency. And slowly, you began seeing small changes. They became more direct. They stopped disappearing whenever a conversation became difficult. They apologized without attaching excuses. They asked what you needed instead of assuming. They remembered that your heart had been involved in this too. Nothing was perfect. There were still moments of hesitation. Old habits do not vanish because someone finally speaks the truth. But now, when fear appeared, they named it. I don't know how to say this. I am scared. I don't want to misunderstand you. I need a moment. Those simple sentences did more than the grand confession had done. Because love is not proven by how intensely someone feels when they are afraid of losing you. It is revealed by how they behave when they know they could lose you and still choose honesty. You began to understand that the secret had never really been the most important part of the story. The important part was what the secret had taught both of you. You learned not to abandon yourself while waiting for another person to become brave. They learned that protecting their heart by withholding truth can wound another heart in the process. And somewhere between those lessons, something softer became possible. Not a guaranteed reunion. Not a perfect ending. Something better. A truthful beginning. Perhaps that is why the secret had to become visible. Not so everyone could know. Not so you could finally say, I was right. Not so they could receive applause for admitting what they should have admitted earlier. It became visible because hiding had stopped serving either of you. And sometimes, beloved child, truth enters our lives in exactly that uncomfortable way. It does not arrive when everything is ready. It arrives when the old way of living has become impossible. You may have wondered why someone could care so deeply and still remain silent. Now you know. People are complicated. Fear can stand beside love. Pride can stand beside longing. Regret can exist alongside affection. Someone can miss you and still be afraid to reach for you. Someone can love you and still need to learn how to love without making you carry the weight of their fear. That does not excuse what happened. But understanding it can release you from the need to turn every unanswered question into a judgment against yourself. You were never too difficult to love simply because someone was too frightened to admit what they felt. You were never unworthy because someone hesitated. You were never foolish because you sensed something beneath the silence. And you do not have to become responsible for someone else's courage now that the truth is finally out. Let them carry their part. Let them prove what they mean through what they do. Let time reveal whether their confession was simply relief from keeping a secret or the beginning of genuine change. You do not have to force the answer. You do not have to chase it. You do not have to become smaller so someone feels safe enough to approach you. There is a strange kind of freedom in no longer needing to decode another person's silence. You can simply watch. You can listen. You can choose. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about this story is not that their love was finally discovered. It is that you were finally given back your own certainty. For so long, their silence had made you question yourself. Now you know that your heart had been responding to something real. But you also know that reality alone is not enough. What matters next is choice. What matters is whether they choose honesty when honesty becomes uncomfortable. Whether they choose consistency when excitement fades. Whether they choose responsibility when old wounds become inconvenient. Whether they can love you in daylight after spending so long loving you from the shadows. Because hidden love can feel intense. It can feel almost sacred because everything is unsaid. But real love eventually has to become visible in ordinary life. In conversations. In patience. In accountability. In showing up. In keeping promises. In listening when the other person says, "That hurt me." In staying present when there is nothing romantic or dramatic happening. That is where the truth of love lies. Not only in the moment someone finally says, "I love you," but in what happens the morning after. And the day after that. And the difficult conversation after that. The person who once hid their feelings eventually understood this. They had thought the hardest part would be admitting they loved you. It wasn't. The hardest part was learning what that love required from them. It required humility. It required patience. It required accepting that you might not trust them immediately. It required understanding that your healing could not be rushed simply because they had finally become honest. And it required them to stop asking, silently or otherwise, for a reward for doing what should have been done much earlier. So they waited. Not passively. Not as a performance. They simply allowed you to decide what place, if any, they would have in your life. And that changed the meaning of everything. Because love without freedom becomes pressure. Love with freedom becomes a choice. You eventually found yourself thinking about the person differently. Not because the past had disappeared, but because you no longer had to fill its empty spaces with assumptions. You knew what had happened. You knew what they had hidden. You knew why they had hidden it. And you knew that the truth was not a promise about the future. It was simply the truth. That was enough. One evening, much later, you found yourself beside them again. There was no audience. No dramatic confession. No secret left to expose. Just two people sitting together, talking about something ordinary. At one point, they looked at you and smiled. You asked, "What?" They almost gave the old answer. Nothing. Then they stopped. A small smile appeared. "No," they said. "Actually, I was thinking something." "What?" They looked at you for a moment. "I spent so much time being afraid that you'd find out how much I cared." You smiled faintly. "And now?" They shook their head. "Now I'm more afraid of ever making you doubt it again." You did not answer immediately. You did not need to. Because some moments do not require a perfect response. They simply need to be allowed to exist. And perhaps that is where the story should rest. Not on a promise that everything will become perfect. Not on the idea that every hidden love is destined to return. Not on the belief that every person who regrets losing you will suddenly become the person you needed. But on something quieter. The truth eventually asks to be lived. If someone truly cares for you, let their actions carry what their words once hid. If someone has hurt you, let their apology be the beginning of accountability rather than the end of it. If someone finally tells you what they should have told you long ago, you are allowed to listen without surrendering your boundaries. And if the truth gives you closure instead of reunion, that is still a gift. Because closure does not always mean getting the person back. Sometimes it means getting yourself back. The part of you that spent nights wondering. The part of you that questioned your intuition. The part of you that kept searching through old conversations for evidence that you had mattered. You mattered. You mattered before the confession. You mattered before the secret became public. You mattered before they found the courage to say what they had been carrying. Their realization did not create your value. Their regret did not create your worth. Their love did not give you something you were missing. It simply revealed something that had been hidden. And perhaps, beloved child, that is the part you were meant to understand all along. Some truths arrive late. Some people speak only after silence has already caused damage. Some feelings remain hidden until hiding them becomes more painful than admitting them. And sometimes the person who finally tells the truth is not doing it to change your future. They are doing it because you deserve to know the past accurately. So let the truth be what it is. Do not force it into the shape of the ending you once imagined. If they come closer, let them come with honesty. If they ask for another chance, let them understand that a second chance is not a return to the old relationship. It is an invitation to build something different. And if you decide that your heart has already traveled too far to return, let that decision be peaceful too. You do not owe someone a relationship simply because they finally confessed. You do not owe them access because they finally became vulnerable. You do not owe them the version of you that once waited. But you can still appreciate the truth. You can still forgive. You can still remember the good without reopening the door. And perhaps that is the deepest kind of healing. Not pretending that nothing happened. Not pretending that you never cared. But being able to look at what happened without allowing it to define what happens next. Their secret love is no longer hidden. People know. You know. They know that you know. The strange dance of pretending is over. But what comes next is quieter. More honest. More difficult. And perhaps more beautiful because of that. Because now there is nowhere left for either of you to hide. And sometimes, beloved child, that is where real love finally begins. Not when someone secretly longs for you. Not when someone becomes jealous of losing you. Not when your absence finally teaches them your value. But when the hiding ends. When the excuses end. When the fear is spoken instead of disguised. When two imperfect people stand in front of one another and say, in whatever words they can manage, "This is what I felt. This is what I did. This is where I failed you. This is what I am willing to change. And this time, I will let you choose." That final freedom matters. Because love should never require you to surrender your judgment. You can hear the confession. You can feel the tenderness. You can remember the moments. You can acknowledge that something real existed. And still choose slowly. Still protect your peace. Still let actions speak. The secret may have become public. But the future does not belong to the secret. It belongs to the choices made after the truth is known. And for the first time, those choices are no longer being made in the dark.